So here are some questions that drive my research. For example, how do global changing processes affecting freshwater ecosystems, as, for example, hydrological alterations, land cover alterations, and overfish affect the ecosystem and the fish ecology at different scales? And what are the outcomes of these impacts to aquatic biodiversity, food webs, and fisheries? And to address these questions, as I mentioned, I've been using different interdisciplinary approaches and theories from the fields of biology, ecology, and resource management and governance. So here I just highlighted a few keywords that are relevant for my research. And so I've been largely focusing on Amazonian rivers. So just so I have an idea, how many of you, or does anybody work or have you worked with fish and fisheries? Ezra. Okay.
I will.
You will. You are. Yeah, okay. We have it. I can't see everybody on Zoom, but I guess there are some folks there that work with fisheries.
We have one on Zoom.
One on Zoom. Yeah, so you might be aware that Amazonian rivers support the highest taxonomic and potentially the functional diversity of freshwater fish species in the world. So there are thousands of species described, many others still to be described, many endemic species. This fish fauna represents about 16% of the total fish diversity in the world. And this fish fauna has evolved diverse ecological strategies or diverse traits, which I'm going to be talking about more soon. But they've evolved these diverse strategies to cope with the extremely high spatial, temporal, environmental heterogeneity and complexity of habitats and a range of ecological variations. So in aquatic systems in the Amazon, especially in floodplain systems, landscape and hydrologic dynamics play a key role to the structure and function of the ecosystems. And in the Amazon River floodplain, which is highlighted in this image, flow pulses of, on average, 10 meters, which can reach 15 meters depending on where you are in the river basin. So these flow pulses, they directly link terrestrial and the aquatic system so that during the high waters, the entire system is flooded, like here. And these flooded areas, especially flooded forests, will provide important feeding and nursery grounds, as well as protection from predators for several fish species. So this process of flow pulse also boosts fish production. And during the dry water, this is more or less the same location, right? And you can see the lands around the main river channel are dry. And depending on the fish ecological strategies, and that means they habitat use strategies or migratory strategies, they will inhabit permanent lakes, secondary channels within the floodplains, or the main river channel. And many of these species are extremely important for Amazonian people as source of protein and income. So maybe you are not aware about that, but the average fish consumption, per capita fish consumption in the Amazon is extremely high, is 6 times higher than the world's average. And so, despite this importance of freshwater systems and fisheries, we also are aware that there are threats to the function and the structure of these freshwater ecosystems in the Amazon, and I'm going to identify here 4 major threats, although there are more, right? Deforestation is one, and this map is showing in yellow the deforested areas in the Amazon basin, so more than 10% of the forests have been lost. Then we have dams that are shown by the dots, so hundreds of dams are in operation or are under construction or being planned for the Amazon. Then we have pollution, and these black grids, they show areas of oil exploration, which are located mainly in the Western Amazon, but there is also widespread mining activities, especially gold mining. And finally, overharvesting. So this figure shows the processes of overharvesting in the Amazon, and it's a process called the fishing down, with historical declines in the mean body size of the main harvested species from the top to the bottom due to overharvesting. So in my research, I've been trying to advance scientific knowledge associated with these conservation problems, and like in the hopes that I can also perhaps provide some suggestions of solutions. And today I'm going to focus specifically on the problems of deforestation and dams. And this is going to take us to the next part, deforestation effects on fish assemblages. So now I'm going to show this schematic figure with variations in the flow posts and connections with the floodplains. And we can see during the dry season, as I mentioned, these lands around the main river channels are dry. And depending on the species' ecological strategies, they will be inhabiting like permanent lakes and secondary channels or the main river channel. Many species will migrate across the river channel. And then the water level starts to rise. And these forests or these riparian zones, they become flooded. So many species will migrate laterally to these floodplain areas, to these flooded forests, where they can find major sources of carbon supporting the biomass. They find protection from predators, nursery grounds. So despite of this importance of forests to maintain fish biomass, at that time, no studies had evaluated how forest loss can impact fish diversity, biomass, and aquatic food webs. So here, my colleagues and I, we hypothesized that land cover changes, or more specifically forest loss, would affect fish diversity, biomass, and food webs, right? But we also, our hypothesis was also that fish's responses to land cover changes should vary depending on the combinations of traits. And what I mean with traits, if you are not like directly in this field of ecology, so it means that it's any characteristics of organisms that affect the way that they respond to environmental change or environmental conditions. It can be also characteristics that impose an effect on an ecosystem property. And we can think of morphological characteristics, behavioral, metabolical. And just to bring an example here, we have these life history traits, which are represented by trade-offs among demographic parameters of fishes. So for example, we have fecundity, degree of parental care, and maturation size. And within these trade-offs, we have three ending points: a periodic, an opportunistic, and an equilibrium life history strategist. And within this triangle, we would expect that equilibrium strategists, they would be more vulnerable or more strongly and negatively affected by forest loss, because species with these strategies, they enhance their offspring survivorship and recruitment within structurally complex habitats of flooded forests. So we also developed this hypothesis associated with other combinations of traits, as for example, habitat uses, strategies, or niche dimensions, trophic, and the migratory, right? So how does fish with different life history and all these combinations of traits respond differentially to land cover change? So that was the question. And then to address this question, we selected an area in the Amazon River, which has been historically impacted, the lower Amazon. So the lower Amazon that is shown in that square in the insert has been deforested. More than 50% of the forests there have been lost, mainly due to cattle ranch and crop plantation. So we first, to address the questions and just like to recap, to understand the weather and how forestry laws or land cover changes are affecting fish diversity, the biomass distributions of fish and aquatic food webs. Our first task was to map the vegetation cover in this area using remote sense techniques. And here I'd like to highlight the collaboration. My collaborator, Laura Hess from UC Santa Barbara. And this figure shows the result of this map. So in yellow, we can see the predominant vegetation in the region, herbaceous. And in green, the only 13% of forest remain. So I'm gonna show a couple of images just to give you a sense of what this vegetation look like. At the top right, you see a view from the lake to the flooded forest and a view within the flooded forest. And then we have the herbaceous. Well, perhaps if you've been in the Amazon, in other floodplain areas, you haven't been in the lower Amazon, you may be surprised to see this kind of vegetation and how widespread it is. So it's important to mention that 75% of the lands that were covered by forest were converted into this kind of vegetation. And sometimes you can walk for miles without seeing like a single tree, right? So having mapped the vegetation, we went to the field to collect data across a gradient of forest conditions from habitat that have very little forest cover and herbaceous is predominant to habitats where you have more than 80% of forest cover. So across several habitats, more than 400 habitats across this gradient, we collected fish using standardized sets of gill nets. So this gear that you are seeing at the bottom right. And for many species that we collected using gill nets, we also collected muscle tissues. Here we were collecting tissues, and in the habitats, we collected major basal sources of production. And that was for the food web component of the study that we developed using stable isotope analysis. But this is a topic for another talk. I'm not gonna discuss these results today. I will just focus on the fish diversity and biomass. We also collected fish across more than 300 floating macrophyte needles. And this illustrates well what a floating macrophyte, aquatic macrophyte in the Amazon. We did that using seine nets. And these floating vegetations, aquatic vegetations, they support high diversity of fish species, especially species that are of smaller body size, but it also serves as nursery ground for species that will grow larger and that are important in the fisheries. And this guy here, he is standing on these macrophytes, and his name is Sam Greenstead. He is a grad student working with me on this data, and today I will be sharing one of his results. Okay, so now let's talk about some of the results. What did we find? So we found that both the taxonomic and the functional assemblage structure was strongly associated with the gradient of forest. So here I'm gonna show you like species and functional groups that were associated with forest and other species and functional groups that were associated with herbaceous vegetation. And this is gonna be shown in these plots, which are the results of redundancy analysis. Doesn't matter much, it's a multivariated analysis, but even if you are not familiar with this analysis, I'm hoping that you can get a sense of how these habitats are distributed in the space. So the score for the habitats are shown in a gradient of forest, where the yellow dots, they represent areas with very little forest cover, herbaceous cover is there, and the green represent habitats with more forest cover. So first, the groups that were associated with forest. We found a variety of species that are known to feed on terrestrial resources, a optimal source of production. Species that are associated with habitat complexity were associated positively with forest. Several trophic groups, invertebrates, detritivores, herbivores were associated with forest. We see several, or at least two major groups of life history strategies: equilibrium, as I explained it earlier, but also periodic strategies were associated with forest. And then we have species with different habitat use strategies, including benthic dweller species, so species that use the substrate more, and species that are surface dwellers, so these are species that feed at the surface. We also have these species are epibenthic maneuverable, that are species capable of making vertical turns, so they are associated with habitat complexity, right? These were associated with forest. But other species and other functional groups were there, like at the herbaceous side of things. And then we have species that are considered to have a more generalistic habitat, species with pelagic behavior, species that are piscivores or planktivores, and that's possibly because they take advantage of foraging in open waters. Species with intermediate life history strategy, and finally, species that have greater swimming capacity, so burst swimmers, for example. Those were strongly associated with herbaceous. These results, just a takeaway message, these results, they indicate that spatial patterns of taxonomic and functional assemblage structure or diversity are not only associated with forest, but also with entire mosaics of configurations of land cover types within the floodplains. Okay, next, I'm going to discuss about or present the results about the responses of fish biomass to this gradient of forest. And I understand this is a lot, a lot to digest, but just be with me, and I'm hoping that I can drive you through the main results here. So these plots are showing the model's coefficient for the biomass responses of each functional group in the different colors across this gradient of forest in the x-axis, right? And you can see the relations, and the steepness of the slope indicates the strength of the relationships. The plots also show the confidence intervals of these estimations. And what did we find? So we found that, I'm just going to highlight, so you guys please turn your attention just to the plots that I'm highlighting in the panel. So the total fish biomass and the biomass of species that were highly important for fisheries were positively associated with forest. What does that mean? That greater is the amount of forest in an area, greater is the total fish biomass and the biomass of species that are highly important for the local fisheries. And these results, they were driven by the responses of few functional groups. So the biomass of these functional groups that I'm highlighting in the panel were positively associated with forest, including the detritivores and equilibrium strategists, and the other species that are not highlighted, or functional groups. The biomass were slightly associated with forest, but these relations were not significant. And some had really neutral relations. So what does that mean? As we expected, fish biomass respond to forest cover, And as we expected as well, the strength of the responses are associated or dependent on the species' functional traits. So these results, a quick takeaway as well, they indicate that forestry loss can lead to reduced fish biomass with certain functional groups and species that of greatest economic importance being most vulnerable, right? So next, I know this is a lot, just be with me, we'll get there. But this is interesting. So this is following up and looking at the threshold responses of species. So it's a threshold indicator analysis. And it shows shifts in the macrophytes fish assemblages along this gradient of forest in the x-axis. So these shaded curves, they indicate the shifts in abundance of species that are indicators in the y-axis, and these black vertical lines in the middle of each curve, they indicate the threshold levels. And we can see two groups of indicator species. So at the top, we can see in gray species that tended to increase in abundance as forest cover declined. At the bottom, we see species that tended to decline in abundance as forest cover declined. So the sensitivity taxa, or the sensitive indicator species. Okay, so the species at the top, the tolerant taxa, had the main threshold levels. That means when they abruptly increased in abundance around 10 to 20% of forest cover. And the sensitivity taxa had the main threshold levels, or they declined abruptly in abundance around 40% or below 40%, they tended to decline. These results, they are consistent with the results of the previous study, and it's basically indicating these divergent responses of fishes to land cover change or forest loss that is dependent on the functional traits or the ecological strategies. And another takeaway here is that combined, these results indicate that continued forest loss or continued land cover change can potentially lead to losses of both taxonomic and functional diversity, with losses of unique species and unique functional traits. So now I'm gonna switch gears and I will discuss about dams. So before I get there, just take a deep breath, and we still have more, I believe, like 20 minutes to go. So just relax a little bit. I'm gonna drink a sip of water. All right, so starting here. So this is a policy perspective paper that was led by Weinmiller. And there we discussed that the three globally significant river basins in terms of fish biodiversity, the Amazon, Congo, and Mekong, are experiencing a boom in hydropower dam construction. So although these river basins, they hold about 1/3 of the entire freshwater fish diversity in the world, hundreds of dams are in operation or under construction or being planned for these river basins alone. However, we know that dams impact the river, fish, and fisheries ecology. So in this study, my colleagues and I, we synthesized fishes' responses to river impoundments across tropical rivers. And this image came from this paper, and we discussed that in the Paraná River floodplain, which is located in the south of Brazil, the river conditions changed completely after the construction of the Itaipu Dam. And the Itaipu Dam, just as other dams, disrupted connectivity, so both lateral and longitudinal connectivity, disrupting fish access to important spawning and feeding grounds. And in addition to imposing this physical barrier to fish migration, dams are usually built where rapids and waterfalls boosts hydropower potential. These high gradient reefs, they are usually home for a unique fish fauna with traits that are adaptive to life in fast-flowing water. So you can see images of endemic species for the Amazon, the Congo, and the Mekong River. So in this study here, we discussed that following impoundments or following hydropower dam construction across the tropics, species tended to respond differentially according to their functional traits. So they respond differentially to the changes in the environmental conditions, which is going to result in a fairly predictable shift in the assemblage composition. And we can identify species and traits that are more vulnerable to these changes. And those are species with traits that are adaptive to life in fast-flowing waters, flow poles, structural complexity, species that depend on connectivity across river basins to complete the life cycle. So given these well-known impacts, here I'm going to attempt to summarize the impacts of the dams that are among the largest dams in the world, which were built in the Amazon. And they were specifically built in the Xingu River in the eastern Amazon and in the Madeira River in the western Amazon. So the Belo Monte Dam complex in the Xingu and the Santo Antônio and Girau Dam in the Madeira River. So I'm gonna do this based on more than 10 years of data collection and collaborations that I'm gonna highlight in a minute. And I'm going to discuss the impacts of these dams on fish assemblages, fisheries, and fishers' livelihoods. Before I get into the results, I would like to share more about these study areas. So we see here the Xingu River. In the left, the Xingu River in the eastern Amazon. And this image in the left shows this river reach before the construction, the conclusion of the Belo Monte Dam complex. And in the right, you can see the same river reach after 2017 when the dams were concluded. So you can visually notice that there was a change in the hydrologic dynamic of the area. With this area, Volta Grande, this river reach being strongly impacted, so water was diverted from the Volta Grande to this newly formed reservoir, right? And then we can move on to the Madeira River, where the Santo Antônio and the Girau dams were concluded in 2010. So at the top, in right, you can see the river, the Madeira River had these falls, these rapids, right? And that was done, like was flooded. And this traditional fishing technique, where fishers, they use it to build this large structure and use it, these long harpoons to catch migratory catfishes, this fishery went completely extincted. It disappeared. So I'm hoping that in the next minutes, I will provide some insights on the actual impacts of the dams on fish assemblages, yields, and livelihoods of people there. So first, coming back to the first area, Xingu. So this is our work in development. I've been working with this group of co-authors, including Vanessa Reis. She is a postdoctoral fellow working with our group. And we investigated spatial temporal responses of fishery yields to the Belo Monte Dam complex. And we did that, or I mean, we are doing that based on fishing monitoring data that has been collected across 10 localities covering periods pre and post dam construction. So in terms of analysis, what we did was to model the responses of fishery yields to the dams, as well as to a number of other variables that are known to influence fish yields or that are known to be influenced by the dams, right? So they are listed there, and we did these at different scales. So it's a multi-scale analysis. We have a local scale that is comprised by a buffer around the fishing sites, and we also have regional scales that are comprised by catchment areas. So a couple of results here. I'm going to highlight the plots that I'm discussing, but we found that at all scales of analysis, fishery yields were strongly associated with dam. So after the dam, we see an average decline in fishery yields of 23%. And we also found out that fishery yields, in addition to dam, is related to forest, seasonality, fishing efforts, which we were expecting. And at the largest scale of analysis, we see a relation with rainfall. So takeaway, these results are showing that only a few years after this mega dam was concluded, fishery yields declined. And the results also show these complex associations of yields with multiple variables at multiple scales. So next, I think I didn't mention, but just to put in a context, I'm gonna present the results of four studies. They were papers that are in development or they were published. So this is gonna be the second. Here, that one was related to fisheries, and now it's related to the fish assemblages, right? So we investigated the impacts of the Belo Monte Dam complex on fish assemblages, and this was led by Fred Kepler. He is also a postdoctoral fellow working with this group of co-authors. And so we used fish surveys data that were collected across different habitat types in the Xingu River. And this is based on a before-after control design. So we see the sites distributed by the dots in this river. And they are located in certain distance from the dams. So you have the sites upstream, reservoir, downstream, and so on. And we used a joint species distribution model to explore the responses of the fish assemblages to the dams and a number of variables, while also accounting for the species functional traits and the phylogenetic relations. And just to share one of the results, we found large variations in species responses, large variations of species occurrence to the dams. And this is shown in this plot by the slope of the model coefficients, or the model coefficients are shown here. You see this density plot. So all the values that are to the left of 0 indicate the negative responses of species. To the right of 0 indicate positive responses in terms of presence and absence, so in terms of the occurrence. And we can see these across the zones. So a few results here, more descriptive information. We found that species richness declined on average 13%. We also found a change in abundance, but that was of less magnitude. We found the areas in relation to the dam, or the distance from the dams, that were more strongly impacted, and that was the reservoir and the downstream sector. And you can see that this density plot is kind of shifting to the left, showing that most species responded negatively, right? So the decline in richness there was on average 27%. We saw changes in the functional traits, with reduction in body size, reduction in trophic level. And this was just for fun, but I included examples of species belonging to the families that were more strongly affected. So I know it's not everybody that is in fish ecology here, but we have Serrasalmidae, Anastomidae, and Pimelodidae. And that's largely driven, these changes are largely driven by functional characteristics of these families that were more strongly affected. So just a few years after the dam construction, 5 years after the dam construction was finalized and Belo Monte started to operate, we saw declines in yields. We also saw declines in richness, in abundance of less magnitude, but yet. And we also are again like coming back to the land cover responses of fish response to land cover. We are also seeing that species with certain combinations of traits are more vulnerable. Okay, so I'm approaching the end, I promise. So it's just, I only have more 2 studies to share. And now I'm coming back to the Madeira in the Western Amazon. And here we used a functional approach to understand the responses of fishery yields to the dams in the Madeira River. And I would like to highlight here contributions, my colleagues, including Juliana Laufer. She is a postdoctoral associate at FIU here, working at the Tropical Rivers Lab with Dr. Anderson. So you can see in A, the image before the dams and the same location after the dams in B, and the dam show one of the dams shown in C. And here we asked whether the dams, they changed the composition of species in the yields, whether the yields were affected and how they were affected. And to address these questions, we used, again, a fishing monitoring data that has been collected across 17 communities. And these show the map, the Madeira River, the communities where we collected this data, largely led by Carolina Doria, which is here. But the communities are shown by the squares and the triangle, right? And these data covered periods pre and post dam construction. For the same species comprising the yields, so you have the species in yields, we also collected functional traits that are known to be affected by changes in environmental conditions caused by the dams. And we also collected environmental factors, such as hydrology and land cover that are affected by the dams. And we used a second data set to understand how these changes potentially affected fishing-based income, right? So this data is derived from interviews conducted across 13 communities, distributed in the map, and we can see these locations by the squares and the circles. So a few results, we found that the amount of fish that each fisher catches per day, or the catch per unit of force, declined in 37% after the dams, and that affected the fishing basin income as well. So the income declined on average 30%. And this is the result of a analysis that is called the RLQ. It's a multivariated analysis again, so you can see this multidimensional space with 5 species clusters that are organized, or they are clumped together, grouped together according to trait syndromes that were associated with pre and post dam construction periods, or the environmental conditions associated with these periods. And I'm just going to highlight major patterns of association. So cluster A was strongly associated with pre-dam conditions, right? Pre-dam environmental conditions. And in this cluster were species that grow large, species of large body size, that migrate. And in this cluster were the species of high economic importance. We had another cluster that was associated with post-dam conditions, environmental conditions, and those were species of reduced body size, species that have a laterally compressed body, meaning that they have some sort of pelagic habit, right? And in this cluster were species of lower to mid economic importance. And so just to give you an idea of how two traits or indicators varied across these clusters. So here I'm highlighting the total length and the market value across this species cluster. Just turn your attention, just pay attention on the bars for cluster A and B, so green and pink. We can see that species in cluster A that were associated with pre-dam construction, they had the body size that were 3 times larger and market value that were 2 times greater than species in cluster D, which is associated with post-dam construction. So what we are seeing here is basically that there was a shift in the functional composition of yields, right, from species of large body size and high market value to species of reduced body size, lower market value, which in turn partially explains the reductions in catch and the reductions in the fishing-based income. Okay, so last thing is, and then we were interested in understanding, okay, so we are seeing these shifts in composition, declines in yields. What are the fishers, the people there, what are their perceptions? So that is where we addressed the questions of whether and in which extent fishers perceived impacts in the fishing activities, and what they did in response to that. Did they implement adaptation strategies to cope with these changes or what? Right, so to answer these questions, we conducted interviews with communities in regions upstream and downstreams to the dam. And now I know everybody's done, right? I'm pretty sure. I didn't include any stats. Yeah. I just included a graphical abstract that summarizes our main finds. But if you are curious, you want to see, oh, how did you get into these conclusions? You can download this manuscript that is available online, and you will see the numbers. But what is important here is that we found out that the fishers, they perceived the impacts. So they were impacted, and they perceived these declines in fishery yields and in fishing profits as well. There was also, consistent with the previous result, this shift in the composition of yields. So to cope with these impacts, they implemented adaptation strategies, and that's within the domains of assets, flexibility, and the learning. So first, in general, they changed the type of gears, the major type of gears that they were using. So we see declines in the uses of more traditional fishing techniques, like that one that I showed before, and increases in the uses of less selective gears that can, for example, gill nets that can catch a wide range of species. So they also increased fishing efforts. So now they are spending more time in fishing. They are traveling further away and exploring new fishing grounds. And finally, in response to the changes in the composition of yields, we see also a general trend of change in the species that they are selling. So the species that are commercialized and the species that are consumed changed. And there was a reduction in the fish consumption at the household level. So basically, these results are consistent with the results of the previous study showing that the dams impacted these communities' livelihoods, and that in response, they needed to adapt certain fishing strategies, or otherwise they would be excluded from this fishery. And then I'm just gonna provide you like a broad, high-level conclusion, just a takeaway message that together the results, they are indicating that's necessary to develop mechanisms or better mechanisms to protect the forest, but not only forest. We've seen that's important to consider entire mosaics of land cover types within floodplains. And the results also highlight the importance of maintaining flow pulses and free-flowing rivers and tributaries that are important for the completion of life cycles of species with vulnerable traits, including species that are of greatest economic importance. And then with that, I would like to thank these studies, sponsors and partners. And maybe if I have time, I can take any questions. Thank you.